The bitter taste of copper flooded Josephine Walker's mouth as she bit her lip to stop its quivering, her trembling fingers hastily stuffing the last of her meager possessions into a worn leather satchel. Dawn had barely broken over the rugged Montana landscape of 1882, the first golden rays of sunlight sneaking through the cabin window as she prepared to disappear from this place forever. 3 months she'd been here, 3 months of working as housekeeper to the most infuriating, stubborn, impossibly handsome rancher in all of Montana territory. 3 months of pretending she wasn't running from a past that threatened to catch up with her any day. 3 months of fighting the dangerous pull she felt toward Brody Callahan, a man who had no idea who she really was or what she'd done. Josephine closed the satchel with trembling hands, securing it with a length of twine. She'd leave the dress he'd bought her hanging in the wardrobe. It felt wrong to take it, like stealing something that wasn't rightfully hers. Just like her name, just like her life here at Callahan Ranch. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she moved toward the door of her small room. Adjacent to the kitchen, where she'd spent countless hours cooking meals for Brody and his ranch hands. She paused, listening for any sign that someone might be awake at this ungodly hour. The only sound was the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance and the whisper of wind through the pine trees surrounding the property. Perfect. The ranch hands would still be asleep in the bunkhouse, and Brody, well, he'd ridden out yesterday to a neighboring ranch to negotiate a cattle deal. He wouldn't be back until afternoon. By then, she'd be long gone, maybe as far as the next territory if she could secure passage on the eastbound train. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Josephine stepped into the kitchen, her boots making no sound on the wooden floor. She'd left a letter on the kitchen table, short, impersonal, thanking Brody for his kindness and explaining that family matters required her immediate departure. It wasn't entirely a lie. Family was indeed the reason she was running. The kitchen was bathed in shadows, familiar objects rendered strange in the half-light. She'd missed this place, the sturdy oak table where the men gathered for meals, the cast-iron stove that had taken her weeks to master, the scent of pine and leather that seemed to permeate everything. She'd missed the people, too kind-hearted Tom, the foreman who'd taught her to ride, young Billy, barely 16 but eager to prove himself among the men, and Brody. She shook her head firmly. No sense dwelling on what could never be. Josephine Walker wasn't even her real name, and once Brody discovered who she really was, he'd despise her. Better to leave now, with some dignity intact, than be driven away when the truth inevitably surfaced. Taking a deep breath, she crept toward the back door that led to the yard, where the horses were kept. If she could saddle Maple, the gentle mare Brody had allowed her to ride, she could return her at the livery in town before catching the train. Another betrayal of trust, but a necessary one. Her hand closed around the door latch when a deep voice from the darkness nearly stopped her heart. "Going somewhere, Miss Walker?" Josephine froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Slowly she turned to find Brody Callahan leaning against the doorframe of the pantry, arms crossed over his broad chest. He was fully dressed in his usual attire, worn denim pants, chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, and his customary leather vest. His dark hair was tousled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. "Mr. Callahan," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. "I thought you were at the Thompson Ranch." His blue eyes, usually warm with good humor, were now cold as the Montana winter. "Clearly!" Josephine clutched her satchel tighter, mind racing for a plausible explanation. "I was just leaving, without so much as a goodbye." He pushed away from the doorframe and took a step toward her. Though his movements were controlled, measured, she could sense the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I saw your letter." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Then you understand? Family emergency." "Lies." The word cut through the kitchen like a knife. "You don't have family waiting for you, Josephine. At least, not the kind you're running to." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Brody's eyes never left hers as he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He didn't open it, didn't need to. 3 days ago, this came in the post, addressed to me personally. Josephine's knees weakened, and she had to grasp the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. "What is it?" But she already knew. A letter from a very concerned attorney in Chicago. Seems he's been searching for a Miss Julia Evans, daughter of the late Richard Evans. Brody's voice remained steady, but his knuckles had turned white around the paper. Imagine my surprise when the description matched my housekeeper down to the birthmark behind her right ear. A strangled noise escaped Josephine's throat. "Brody, I can explain." 3 months, he continued as if she hadn't spoken. 3 months you've been living under my roof, eating at my table, working alongside my men. 3 months of lies. Not all of it was a lie, she whispered. Something flashed in his eyes, pain, perhaps, or disappointment. "Why, Josephine? Or should I call you Julia?" The sound of her real name on his lips made her flinch. "Please don't. I haven't been Julia Evans in a long time." "Then tell me who you are." He took another step toward her, close enough now that she could smell the familiar scent of leather and pine that clung to him. "Tell me why you've been hiding. Tell me who you're running from." Tears threatened, but she blinked them back. Crying wouldn't help her now. Nothing would. "I need to go." She made a move toward the door, but Brody was faster. His hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist not painfully, but firmly enough that she couldn't break free. "She tried to leave in silence," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "The cowboy said, 'You're staying, and you're mine from this day.'" Josephine's eyes widened. "What did you say?" Brody's expression softened marginally. "You heard me. You're not going anywhere, Josephine, not until I get some answers. And after that..." He hesitated, something vulnerable flickering across his face. "After that, you're still not going anywhere." "You can't keep me here against my will," she protested, though her heart had begun to race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Can I?" His lips curved in a humorless smile. "This is my ranch, my land, and until I know exactly what kind of trouble you're in, you're staying right here where I can protect you." "Protect me? You don't even know me." "I know enough." His grip on her wrist gentled, but he didn't let go. "I know you're the hardest worker I've ever hired. I know you can bake an apple pie that would make angels weep. I know you sing to yourself when you think no one's listening. And you save scraps from dinner for the stray cat behind the bunkhouse." Josephine stared at him, speechless. She hadn't realized he'd been paying such close attention. "I know enough to know I want to know more," Brody continued, his voice softening. "So you're staying, Miss Walker, or Miss Evans, or whoever you are. You're staying right here until I figure out exactly why I can't seem to get you out of my head, day or night." The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. "Brody?" "Sit down," he said, nodding toward the kitchen table. "The coffee's already brewing, and then you're going to tell me everything. Starting with why a high-born Chicago lady is hiding out on a Montana cattle ranch, and ending with who's got you scared enough to run in the middle of the night." Josephine hesitated, her gaze darting toward the door. "Don't even think about it," Brody warned, the corner of his mouth lifting in a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've got men posted at every exit. Tom's been suspicious of you from day one." "Tom?" she repeated, betrayal stinging. "But he taught me to ride. He was kind to me. Tom's loyal to me above all else. And he's been in this territory long enough to recognize when someone's hiding from something." Brody released her wrist and pulled out a chair. "Sit, Josephine, please." The please softened his command, made it sound almost like a request. With a resigned sigh, Josephine sank into the chair, her satchel dropping to the floor beside her. Brody moved to the stove, returning moments later with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Now," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Start from the beginning." Josephine wrapped her hands around the warm mug, drawing strength from its heat. "My father was Richard Evans, owner of Evans Banking and Trust in Chicago." Brody nodded. "I've heard of it. He died 6 months ago." Josephine took a sip of coffee, buying time to organize her thoughts. "Everyone believed it was his heart he'd had problems for years. But I found papers in his desk, correspondence that suggested something more sinister." "Murder?" Brody's expression sharpened. "Possibly. The letters implied that certain business partners were unhappy with my father's unwillingness to involve the bank in their enterprises." She looked up at him. "Illegal enterprises involving everything from smuggling to political corruption." When I confronted my father's partner, Arthur Blackwell, he laughed it off, said I was a silly girl who understood nothing of business. But you didn't believe him. No. Josephine's fingers tightened around the mug. A week later, someone broke into my bedroom in the middle of the night. I was downstairs, couldn't sleep. If I'd been in bed... She shuddered at the memory. Brody's jaw tightened. What did they take? Nothing. The housekeeper heard the noise and raised the alarm. But I knew it was a warning. She met his gaze steadily. 2 days later, I disappeared. Withdrew what money I could from my personal account. Left most of my belongings and boarded a train west. I've been Josephine Walker ever since. And now this attorney is looking for you. She nodded. My father's will left everything to me. His only child. If I don't return to claim my inheritance, it all goes to the bank to Arthur Blackwell. Convenient for him, Brody observed grimly. Yes. She hesitated, then added quietly, There's more. Before he died, my father was gathering evidence against Blackwell and several prominent Chicago businessmen. Evidence of fraud, bribery, perhaps worse. I don't know what happened to those documents, but if Blackwell thinks I have them or know where they are, he'll keep coming after you, Brody finished for her. Now you understand why I need to keep moving. Josephine pushed back her chair and stood, her decision made. I've already put you and your ranch in danger by staying as long as I have. If they trace me here, let them come, Brody interrupted, rising to his feet as well. His considerable height forced her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. My land, my rules. And rule number 1 is that no one threatens what's mine. Heat flooded Josephine's cheeks at his possessive tone. I'm not yours. Aren't you? He took a step closer, his voice dropping to that rumble that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. You've been mine since the moment you showed up on my doorstep, soaked to the skin from the rain, claiming to be looking for work. I just didn't know it yet. Brody, she protested weakly. No more running, Josephine. He reached out, hesitating only briefly before brushing a strand of auburn hair back from her face. The touch, so gentle from a man whose hands were calloused from hard work, sent a shiver down her spine. Whatever's coming, we face it together. Here. On Callahan land? Why would you do that? Risk everything for someone you barely know? Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability she'd never seen before in the stoic rancher. Because in 3 months, you've become as necessary to me as the air I breathe, and I'll be damned if I let you disappear without a fight. Josephine's heart stuttered in her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying stay. His hand moved to cup her cheek, thumb brushing across her skin with a tenderness that made her want to weep. Stay, not as my housekeeper, but as whatever you want to be, whatever we could be, together. The rawness in his voice, the naked honesty in his eyes, stole her breath away. In that moment, the walls she'd built around her heart since fleeing Chicago began to crumble, but the fear remained. They'll find me eventually, she whispered. Let them try. A dangerous smile curved his lips. I didn't build this ranch from nothing by being easy to intimidate. Montana territory has its own brand of justice, and out here, a man protects what's his. You keep saying that I'm yours. Despite herself, Josephine found her body leaning toward him, drawn by an invisible force she couldn't resist. You can't just claim a person, Brody Callahan. His smile softened, became something tender that made her knees weak. Watch me. And then he was kissing her, his arms wrapping around her waist to draw her against his solid chest. The first brush of his lips against hers was tentative, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Josephine did the opposite, rising on her tiptoes to press closer, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. The kiss deepened, months of unspoken feelings pouring out between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that she wasn't going anywhere. Not today. Maybe not ever. I'm still mad at you for lying, Brody murmured against her lips, though the smile in his voice belied his words. I'm still mad at you for ambushing me, she countered, unable to suppress her own smile. Fair enough? He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. So you'll stay? At least long enough for us to figure this out." Josephine took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood on the precipice of something monumental. "Yes, I'll stay." The slow smile that spread across Brody's face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Good. Because I meant what I said, Josephine Walker, or Julia Evans, or whatever name you choose. From this day forward, you're mine to protect, mine to care for." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Mine to love, if you'll let me." And in that moment, with the Montana dawn breaking golden across the kitchen, Josephine knew she'd finally found what she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not just safety, but a home, a future, a man whose strength matched her own, and whose heart seemed perfectly sized to shelter hers. "I'll let you," she whispered back, and sealed the promise with another kiss. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended state of both tension and unexpected joy. Brody insisted Josephine stay close to the main house, assigning ranch hands to patrol the boundaries of his property. Tom, the weathered foreman, whose kindness hadn't been entirely feigned, apologized gruffly for his suspicions. "Boss's happiness is my concern," he'd told her simply. "And you make him happier than I've seen in years." Those words had warmed her through, almost as much as the gentle touches and heated glances Brody exchanged with her when they thought no one was looking. By unspoken agreement, they hadn't taken their newfound relationship further than stolen kisses and long conversations late into the night. There would be time for more, Brody assured her, once they had dealt with the threat from Chicago. On the 4th morning, Josephine woke before dawn, her body still attuned to the early rising hours required of a housekeeper. She slipped from her room, still her own, though Brody's longing gaze each night when he bid her good night suggested he wished otherwise, and made her way to the kitchen to start breakfast. The sound of male voices stopped her in the hallway. Brody and someone else, their tones urgent but hushed. Moving silently, she approached the kitchen doorway, peering around to see Brody seated at the table with a man she didn't recognize, older, perhaps in his 50s, with a silver badge pinned to his vest. "Sheriff Harris," Brody was saying, his expression grim. "I appreciate the warning." "Thought you should know," the sheriff replied, his weathered face solemn. "2 men arrived on yesterday's train, city folkies asking questions about a young woman matching your housekeeper's description." He paused, eyes narrowing. "They claim to be relatives concerned for her welfare, but they've got the look of men who aren't used to doing their own dirty work." Josephine's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp, but the sound escaped nonetheless. Both men turned, Brody rising immediately to cross to her side. "It's all right," he murmured, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. "Sheriff Harris is a friend." To the sheriff, he added, "This is Miss Josephine Walker." Understanding dawned in the lawman's eyes. "Madam," he said with a respectful nod, "I take it these aren't friendly visitors looking for you?" "No," she admitted, allowing Brody to lead her to the table. "They work for Arthur Blackwell, my father's business partner, the man I believe may have been responsible for my father's death." Sheriff Harris let out a low whistle. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Walker." "I know." Josephine met his gaze steadily. "But I believe it's true, and I believe he wants me dead as well, to prevent me from claiming my inheritance and possibly discovering proof of his crimes." The sheriff studied her for a long moment before turning to Brody. "You vouching for her character, Callahan?" "With my life," Brody replied without hesitation, his hand finding Josephine's beneath the table and squeezing gently. Harris nodded slowly. "That's good enough for me. I'll keep an eye on these visitors, make sure they understand the way things work in our territory." A dangerous smile crossed his face. "We don't much care for outsiders coming in and causing trouble." "Thank you, Sheriff," Josephine said sincerely. After the lawman departed, promising to return if he learned anything more, Josephine turned to Brody, fear evident in her eyes despite her efforts to conceal it. "They're here," she whispered. "They found me." Brody's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "And they'll find more than they bargained for. No one's taking you from me, Josephine. I promise you that. You can't fight hired guns, Brody. These men, they won't hesitate to kill you or anyone else who stands in their way." "Neither will I," he replied simply. And the steel in his voice reminded her that beneath his gentle demeanor with her lay a man who had carved his ranch from untamed wilderness, who had survived everything the harsh Montana territory could throw at him. Still, fear gripped her heart. Maybe I should go, lead them away from here. Brody's expression darkened. We've had this conversation. You're not going anywhere. But, no. He cupped her face in his hands, his blue eyes intense. We face this together. My men are loyal, the sheriff's on our side, and I've sent word to some friends in neighboring ranches. This isn't just your fight anymore, Josephine. It's ours. The conviction in his voice weakened her resolve to protect him by leaving, and truth be told, she didn't want to go. Not from this place that had become home, and certainly not from this man who had somehow become essential to her happiness in such a short time. All right, she conceded, but promise me something. Anything. If things go badly, don't be a hero. Her voice caught. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me. A small smile played at his lips. I'll promise to be careful, if you'll promise the same. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. I've only just found you. Josephine Walker. I'm not ready to let you go. Later that morning, as Josephine was helping Sarah, the woman Brody had hired to take over her household duties, with the washing, a commotion from the front yard drew their attention. Setting aside the sheets she'd been folding, Josephine moved to the window, her heart sinking at the sight of two well-dressed men on horseback, flanked by Tom and two other ranch hands. Stay inside, she instructed Sarah, who nodded wide-eyed. Gathering her courage, Josephine stepped onto the front porch just as Brody emerged from the barn, his stride purposeful as he approached the visitors. Gentlemen, she heard him say, his voice carrying across the yard. I understand you're looking for someone. One of the men, tall and thin with a pencil mustache, smiled thinly. Indeed. We're searching for a Miss Julia Evans, daughter of the late Richard Evans of Chicago. We have reason to believe she might be in this area. And what business would you have with this lady? Brody's tone remained pleasant, but Josephine recognized the dangerous undertone. The second man, shorter and portlier, cleared his throat. Family business. Her uncle is most concerned for her welfare. She left Chicago quite suddenly after her father's passing. You see, not in her right mind with grief, we fear. From her position on the porch, partially concealed by a supporting post, Josephine had to stifle a sound of outrage. She had no uncle, and these men knew it. The blatant lie confirmed everything she'd suspected. These were Blackwell's men, sent to bring her back to Chicago, or worse, to ensure she never returned at all. Brody's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. I see. And do you have any documentation proving your connection to this Miss Evans? Or your authority to speak for her family? The thin man's smile faltered slightly. We have letters from Mr. Blackwell himself, authorizing us to act on his behalf. Blackwell, Brody repeated, as if testing the name. Not Evans? I thought you said her uncle sent you. A flash of annoyance crossed the man's face. Mr. Blackwell is her guardian now, as executor of her father's estate. Interesting. Brody crossed his arms. Well, gentlemen, I'm afraid I can't help you. No one by the name of Julia Evans works on my ranch or resides in this area, to my knowledge. The portly man shifted in his saddle, his hand moving subtly toward his coat, where Josephine suspected he concealed a weapon. Perhaps you misunderstand, Mr. Callahan. We have information suggesting this young woman may be using an alias. Auburn hair, green eyes, about 22 years of age. Sounds like half the young ladies in Montana territory, Brody replied evenly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a ranch to run. The thin man's facade of politeness dropped. We know she's here, Callahan. The shopkeeper in town remembered selling fabric to a young woman matching her description in the company of your foreman. His gaze shifted to Tom, who stared back impassively. We're not leaving without her. Josephine's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She should reveal herself now, before this escalated to violence. These men wouldn't hesitate to shoot Brody or his ranch hands if they stood in their way. Before she could step forward, however, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Harris rode into the yard, accompanied by 3 deputies. Afternoon, he called, tipping his hat to Brody before turning to the strangers. You must be the gentleman asking questions in town. His tone was friendly, but his eyes were hard. I'm Sheriff Harris. I understand you're looking for a missing person." The thin man's expression soured further. "This is a private matter, Sheriff. Nothing's private in my territory when it involves strangers coming in and making folks nervous." The sheriff dismounted leisurely. "Now, I'd like to see those authorization papers you mentioned, and any other identification you might have." A tense silence fell over the yard. Josephine held her breath, watching as the two men exchanged glances. Finally, the thin one reached slowly into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, which he handed to the sheriff with obvious reluctance. Harris read it carefully, his expression giving nothing away. "Interesting," he said at last. "This says you're authorized to locate Miss Evans and escort her home. Doesn't mention anything about guardianship or mental instability." He looked up, eyes narrowing. "Seems to me like a young woman of legal age has every right to go where she pleases." "Mr. Blackwell is concerned for her safety," the portly man insisted. "She's a wealthy heiress, vulnerable to those who might take advantage." "Is that so?" Sheriff Harris handed the paper back. "Well, I don't see an official court document declaring her incompetent. So, as far as I'm concerned, even if this young lady were in my jurisdiction, she'd be free to stay or go as she pleases." The thin man's face flushed with anger. "We have rights." "Not here you don't," Harris interrupted mildly. "Now, I'll ask you gentlemen to state your true business, or to leave Callahan property immediately." For a moment, Josephine thought they might refuse. The thin man's hand twitched toward his coat, much as his companions had earlier, but a subtle shift in positioning from the deputies, hands moving casually toward their holstered guns, seemed to reconsider. "This isn't over," the thin man said, his gaze moving past the sheriff to fix on Brody. "Mr. Blackwell doesn't appreciate interference in his affairs." "Neither do I," Brody replied calmly. "Give Mr. Blackwell my regards when you see him, and tell him Montana Territory isn't Chicago. We protect our own here." With a final venomous glance, the men turned their horses and rode out of the yard, the sheriff's deputies falling in behind them to escort them to the property line. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Josephine step fully onto the porch, her legs trembling so badly she had to grip the railing for support. Brody was at her side in an instant, his strong arm around her waist. "They're gone," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "For now." Sheriff Harris approached, his expression grim. "Those men are trouble, Callahan. They'll be back, and next time they might not be so easily discouraged." "I know." Brody's arm tightened around Josephine. What did that paper really say? "Authorize them to locate Miss Evans and return her to Chicago by any means necessary. Signed by Arthur Blackwell, with what appears to be a legitimate notary seal." The sheriff shook his head. "It's not a legal document that would stand up in any court, but it's enough to make me believe they think they have authority to take her by force if needed." Josephine closed her eyes briefly. "I told you, Brody. They won't stop until they find me." "Then we'll have to stop them first," Brody replied, his voice hardening with resolve. Sheriff Harris nodded thoughtfully. "I'll keep my deputies watching the roads, but I can't spare men indefinitely. And once those two report back to Blackwell that their intimidation tactics didn't work." "He'll send more men," Josephine finished softly. "Men who won't bother with pretenses or papers." The three stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging heavy between them. Finally, the sheriff spoke again. "There might be another way. Not running, not fighting, though we'll do that if we must, but ending this at its source." He turned to Josephine. "You said your father was gathering evidence against Blackwell and his associates before he died. Any idea what became of it?" Josephine frowned, thinking back to those frantic days after discovering the break-in at her Chicago home. "He kept a separate office downtown, away from the bank. He sometimes mentioned a safe there, where he kept documents too sensitive for the bank's vault." "Could the evidence be there?" Brody asked. "Possibly, but Blackwell would have searched it by now." "Maybe," the sheriff agreed. "Or maybe he doesn't know about it. Rich men often keep secrets from their business partners, especially if they suspect wrongdoing." Hope flickered in Josephine's chest for the first time in months. If they could find that evidence, prove Blackwell's crimes, she wouldn't have to spend her life looking over her shoulder. She could reclaim her inheritance, her name, her life. But the hope was quickly tempered by reality. Even if the evidence still exists, it's in Chicago. We're in Montana. Chicago isn't the moon, Brody pointed out. It's reachable by train. Josephine turned to him, alarmed. You can't be suggesting, not you, he clarified quickly. You're staying right here, where I can protect you, but someone could go to Chicago, someone Blackwell's men wouldn't recognize. I have a deputy who'd fit the bill, Sheriff Harris offered. Smart young man, good with details, used to be a Pinkerton before settling out here. Brody nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. It could work. If he could locate your father's office, find this safe. He'd need help, Josephine said, warming to the idea despite her reservations. Someone who knows Chicago, who could guide him to the right places without raising suspicion. She hesitated. I have a friend there, a young woman who worked as my father's secretary. If I could get word to her... That's a start, Sheriff Harris agreed. I'll speak with Deputy Jensen today, see if he's willing to undertake this mission. After the sheriff departed, Josephine and Brody retreated to the privacy of his study. The room smelled of leather and pipe tobacco. Its walls lined with books, evidence of Brody's unexpected scholarly side, which she'd discovered during their late-night conversations. This is dangerous, she said, as soon as the door closed behind them. If Blackwell discovers what we're doing... He won't, Brody assured her, though she could see the concern in his eyes. And it's our best chance of ending this for good. Otherwise, we're just waiting for his next move. Josephine sank into the leather armchair by the window, suddenly exhausted. I never meant to bring all this to your doorstep, Brody. Your ranch, your people, they're all in danger because of me. Stop. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. I made my choice the moment I found you trying to slip away that morning. Actually, no, I made my choice the day you arrived here, soaking wet and determined, asking for work. A tender smile crossed his face. I took one look at you and knew my life was about to change forever. That's impossible, she protested weakly. You couldn't have known. Couldn't I? He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers up her arm. My father used to tell me that when he met my mother, it was like recognition, not introduction, like his soul had been waiting for hers. I never understood what he meant until I saw you standing on my porch. Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. Brody, I love you, Josephine Walker, he said simply. Or Julia Evans. Whatever name you choose, whatever life you want to build, I love you, and I will protect you with everything I have. The declaration, spoken so plainly yet, with such depth of feeling, broke the last of her resistance. Josephine leaned forward, capturing his lips with hers in a kiss that conveyed everything her overwhelmed heart couldn't yet put into words. When they parted, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have from the first moment you showed me kindness, when you had every reason to turn me away. Brody's smile was radiant. Then we'll face whatever comes together. And when this is over, when Blackwell is no longer a threat, we'll build a life together here, or in Chicago, or anywhere else you want. Here, she said without hesitation. This is home now. You are home. The following weeks passed in a strange dichotomy of domestic contentment and constant vigilance. Deputy Jensen departed for Chicago with a letter of introduction to Josephine's friend Margaret, while Sheriff Harris maintained a discreet watch on the town for any sign of Blackwell's men returning. On the ranch, life continued with an outward appearance of normalcy. Josephine insisted on resuming some of her household duties, working alongside Sarah rather than remaining idle. The familiar rhythms of cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the household ledgers provided a welcome distraction from the anxiety of waiting for news from Chicago. Her relationship with Brody deepened with each passing day. Though propriety dictated they maintain separate bedrooms, a concession to appearances that Brody accepted with reluctance, they spent every possible moment together. Mornings riding across the vast expanse of Callahan land, afternoons working side by side as Josephine learned more about the business of running a cattle ranch, evenings sitting before the fire in his study, reading or simply talking until the late hours. And there were the kisses' sweet, tender moments that increasingly carried an undercurrent of desire that threatened to overwhelm them both. More than once, Brody had pulled away with regret in his eyes. murmuring that he wanted to court her properly, to give her the respect she deserved. "I want to make you my wife," he'd whispered one evening, his voice rough with emotion. "When this is over, when you're truly safe, I want to marry you, Josephine, if you'll have me." Her heart had soared at his words, even as a thread of fear lingered. Could they really have a future together? Or would Blackwell's shadow always loom over them? The answer came on a crisp October morning, nearly 6 weeks after Deputy Jensen's departure. Josephine was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening's bread, when the sound of horses approaching drew her attention. Wiping flour from her hands, she moved to the window, her heart leaping at the sight of Sheriff Harris riding into the yard, accompanied by his deputy. Brody emerged from the barn to greet them, his posture tensing as the sheriff dismounted and handed him a packet of papers. Even from a distance, Josephine could see the gravity in the lawman's expression. Unable to wait, she hurried outside, crossing the yard just as Brody looked up from the documents, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Deputy Jensen stepped forward, his youthful face solemn. "Miss Evans, your friend Margaret was extremely helpful. She led me to your father's private office, which remarkably had remained untouched. It seems Blackwell never knew of its existence." Hope surged within her. "And the safe?" "We found it," he confirmed. "And inside, exactly what your father intended someone to find: ledgers documenting years of embezzlement, fraud, and bribery involving Blackwell and several prominent Chicago businessmen and politicians." Josephine's knees weakened, and Brody was immediately at her side, his arm around her waist providing support. "What does this mean?" she asked, hardly daring to believe. Sheriff Harris smiled grimly. "It means Deputy Jensen took those ledgers straight to a federal marshal. Arthur Blackwell was arrested 3 days ago, along with 2 city officials and a judge. The investigation is ongoing, but according to the telegraph we received this morning, they've already uncovered enough evidence to ensure Blackwell spends the rest of his life behind bars." A sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob escaped Josephine's lips. "It's over? Truly over?" "It appears so, Miss Evans," the sheriff replied. "The marshal sent this for you." He handed her an official-looking document. "It formally acknowledges your status as Richard Evans' sole heir and clears the way for you to claim your inheritance without interference." Josephine stared at the paper in her hands, emotions too complex to name washing over her. After months of running, of hiding, of fearing for her life, it was finally over. She could reclaim her name, her fortune, her rightful place in society. But as she looked up at Brody, whose blue eyes watched her with a mixture of joy and apprehension, she realized none of that mattered as much as what she'd found here, on this Montana ranch. "Thank you," she said to Deputy Jensen, her voice steadier now. "And Margaret, is she well?" "Very well," he assured her with a smile that suggested something more than professional gratitude toward the young secretary. "She sends her love and hopes you'll write to her soon." After the lawmen departed, promising to return the following day with any additional news, Josephine and Brody retreated to the privacy of his study. For long moments they simply held each other, the reality of their newfound freedom slowly sinking in. "So," Brody said at last, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes, "Miss Julia Evans, heiress to the Evans banking fortune, I imagine Chicago society will be eager to welcome you back." There was a question in his voice that tore at her heart. "I imagine they will," she agreed softly, "but I won't be there to find out." Hope flared in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Josephine placed her hands on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "My home is here now, Brody, with you, with this life we've started building together." She smiled up at him, love overflowing in her heart. "I don't need Chicago or its society. I need you." The tension drained from his body, replaced by a joy so palpable it seemed to illuminate him from within. "Are you certain your inheritance can be managed from anywhere?" she interrupted. "I'll need to go to Chicago briefly to settle the legal matters, but after that," she took a deep breath, "after that, I'd very much like to return to Montana, as your wife, if that offer still stands." Brody's answer came not in words but in action, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that spoke of promises, of futures, of forever. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "The offer stands," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "It will always stand, Josephine, or Julia, or any name you choose to call yourself." She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "Josephine Callahan has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" His answering smile was brighter than the Montana sun. "The nicest I've ever heard." 2 months later, on a December morning, with snow blanketing the Montana landscape in pristine white, Josephine stood before the small church in town, waiting for the moment that would change her life forever. Her journey to Chicago had been brief but productive. With the help of her father's trusted attorney, not the one who had written to Brody, but an older gentleman who had been Richard Evans' friend for decades, she had claimed her inheritance and established a foundation in her father's name to support worthy causes. She had also sold her childhood home, finding she had no attachment to the grand mansion that had never truly felt like home. The only possessions she brought back to Montana were her mother's jewelry, a few cherished books, and the portrait of her parents that had hung in her father's study. Everything else she left behind, eager to begin her new life unburdened by the past. And now, dressed in a simple ivory gown, with Margaret at her side as maid of honor, she prepared to become Brody Callahan's wife. The church was filled with ranch hands, townspeople, and neighbors who had welcomed her into their community. Sheriff Harris and Deputy Jensen sat in places of honor, the young deputy holding hands discreetly with Margaret, whose extended stay in Montana showed every sign of becoming permanent. When the church doors opened and Josephine began her walk down the aisle, her eyes found Brody immediately. He stood tall and proud at the altar, dressed in his finest suit, his blue eyes shining with such love that it brought tears to her own. This man had saved her in every way a person could be saved, offering shelter when she was homeless, protection when she was in danger, love when she had thought herself unworthy of it. And she had saved him too, bringing laughter and purpose to a life that had been consumed by work and responsibility. As she reached him and placed her hand in his, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. Not in Chicago society, not in the banking world her father had built, but here in the wild beauty of Montana, with a man who had claimed her heart with the simple words, "You're staying, and you're mine, from this day." Words that had once seemed presumptuous now felt like the most beautiful promise. She was his, just as he was hers, bound together not by force or fear, but by a love that had overcome every obstacle. "I love you," Brody whispered as they turned to face the minister. "And I love you," Josephine replied, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain such happiness. From this day, and for all the days to come. 5 years later, Josephine Callahan stood on the front porch of the expanded ranch house, watching as Brody lifted their 3-year-old daughter onto her first pony. Little Emma's delighted squeal carried across the yard, her copper curls the same shade as Josephine's bouncing in the spring sunlight. "Not too fast," Josephine called, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly where their second child grew. "Remember, she's as headstrong as her father." Brody's laugh warmed her even from a distance. "And as fearless as her mother," he called back, his eyes meeting Josephine's with the same love that had only deepened over their years together. The Callahan Ranch had prospered beyond anyone's expectations. With the combination of Brody's expertise in cattle ranching and Josephine's head for business and investments, they had expanded their holdings and built one of the most successful operations in Montana territory. The money from her inheritance had been carefully invested, funding improvements to the ranch and establishing a school in town that bore the Evans name. But more importantly, they had built a life filled with love and purpose. Their home was always open to friends and neighbors, a place of warmth and welcome in the sometimes harsh territory. Josephine had found her place in this community, respected not just as Brody Callahan's wife, but as a woman of intelligence and compassion in her own right. Margaret and Deputy Jensen, now Sheriff Jensen, following Harris's retirement, had married shortly after Josephine and Brody, establishing their own home in town. The two women remained close friends, their bond strengthened by the shared experience of finding love in unexpected places. As Brody led Emma's pony in a careful circle around the yard, Josephine felt a flutter of movement from the baby inside her. A son, she suspected, though she hadn't shared this intuition with Brody. Another child to love. Another branch on the family tree they were growing together. Life wasn't perfect. There were still difficult days, disagreements to work through, challenges to overcome. The ranch demanded constant attention, and balancing motherhood with her role in managing their business required all her energy and ingenuity. But every challenge was faced together, every joy multiplied by sharing it with the man she loved. Brody looked up, catching her watching them, and his smile widened. With a word to Tom, who stood nearby, he handed over Emma's lead rope and crossed the yard to join Josephine on the porch. "You should be resting," he chided gently, his hand coming to rest beside hers on her rounded belly. "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him, leaning into his solid warmth. "Besides, I couldn't miss Emma's first riding lesson." "She's a natural," he said proudly, his gaze returning to their daughter, who was now giggling as Tom led the patient pony in a slightly faster circle. "Just like her mother." Josephine laughed softly. "I hardly qualify as a natural. I nearly fell off the first time you put me on a horse. And then you mastered riding within a week, as I recall." His arm tightened around her shoulders. "You're the most determined woman I've ever known, Josephine Callahan. Once you set your mind to something, heaven help anyone who stands in your way. Including stubborn cowboys who think they know what's best for me," she teased, tilting her face up to his. "Especially those," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Though this particular cowboy has learned his lesson. You make your own choices always. I'm just grateful you keep choosing me." Josephine turned in his embrace, rising on tiptoes to brush her lips against his. "Best choice I ever made," she murmured. "That morning, when I tried to leave in silence. And I said you were staying, and you were mine from that day," he finished, the memory bringing a smile to both their faces. "So presumptuous," she teased. "So right," he countered, capturing her lips in another kiss, this one deeper and full of promise. When they parted, his blue eyes were dark with emotion. "I love you, Josephine, more today than yesterday, less than I will tomorrow. And I love you, Brody Callahan." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. From that day, and for all our days to come. Together, they turned to watch their daughter, hands intertwined, secure in the knowledge that what had begun as an escape had become a homecoming. Josephine had fled Chicago seeking safety, never imagining she would find not just protection, but love, purpose, and a sense of belonging deeper than anything she'd ever known. In the wild beauty of Montana territory, in the arms of a man who had seen her worth from the very beginning, Josephine had found not just a place to hide, but a place to live, to love, to build a future bright with promise. And as the warm spring sun bathed the ranch in golden light, she knew with absolute certainty that there was nowhere else on earth she would rather be. She had tried to leave in silence. The cowboy had said she was staying, that she was his from that day. And in that moment of presumption, of determination, of unexpected love, both their lives had changed forever, for the better, for always.